The flowers inside St. Peter's Church were white and expensive. 300 guests in silk and tailored wool sat waiting for the wedding of the decade. Then, Evelyn Hayes, Manhattan's most powerful real estate mogul, turned her wheelchair away from the altar 60 seconds before the vows. No tears, no collapse. Just silence spreading through the room like a crack in glass. She scanned the length of the aisle until her eyes stopped at the far end, where a janitor in a gray uniform was quietly mopping the floor. She looked at him and asked the last thing anyone expected. "Would you be willing to stand beside me today?" The church had been prepared for weeks. White peonies lined every pew from the entrance to the altar. The ceiling of St. Peter's was lit by cascading chandeliers that cost more than most people's annual salary, and the guest list read like a directory of Manhattan's financial elite. Outside on Fifth Avenue, photographers pressed against the velvet ropes waiting. This was the kind of wedding that got written about in glossy magazines before the couple even said their vows. Evelyn Hayes sat in the bride's preparation room at the back of the church, dressed in a gown that had been custom-made over 4 months. Her hair was pinned with precision. Her makeup was flawless. She looked exactly like what the world expected her to look like, composed, polished, untouchable. She had built that image the same way she had built everything else in her life, deliberately, without sentiment, one controlled decision at a time. She had taken over Hayes Group at 31 after her father's health declined, and the board assumed a young woman would be easy to manage. Within 3 years, she had restructured the company's entire asset portfolio, expanded into 3 new markets, and made every single one of those board members answer to her. The accident 4 years ago had not slowed her down. It had only made her quieter, more careful, more certain that warmth was a liability she could not afford. The wheelchair was just another fact of her life, like the view from her penthouse or the number of zeros in her net worth. Graham Sullivan had proposed at a private dinner in April. He was articulate, well-connected, and had never once treated her disability as something to acknowledge out loud, which she had interpreted as respect. She understood now that it had simply been strategy. Her phone buzzed once on the vanity table beside her. She almost ignored it. The ceremony was less than 10 minutes away, and her assistant had been instructed to hold all calls. But the message came through a personal number she rarely gave out, and the preview showed no sender name, only a small video thumbnail that looked like it had been recorded at a bar. She opened it. The footage was grainy and clearly taken without Graham's knowledge. He was at a table with 2 men she vaguely recognized from his firm, all of them leaning in, laughing. The audio was slightly muffled but clear enough. Graham's voice cut through the background noise without difficulty. He was talking about her, about the company's Class A shares, about the board's current structure, about what would change once they were legally married. Then one of the men said something she couldn't fully hear, and Graham laughed and said that he could handle it, that he'd handled worse, that he wasn't going to spend the rest of his life actually accommodating someone who couldn't walk across a room without help. Evelyn watched the video twice. She set the phone face down on the vanity and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her showed nothing. No trembling lip. No color draining from her face. Just stillness, the particular kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from the few seconds between a blow and the body's decision about how to respond. She could hear the organ beginning its processional warm-up through the walls. 300 people were settling into their seats. Her name was printed on programs that were being passed down every row. There was a photographer positioned at the end of the aisle, and a videographer set up near the altar, ready to capture a ceremony that would be distributed to every society column in the city by morning. She thought about leaving through the side entrance. She thought about calling her assistant and having the guests quietly redirected. She thought about a dozen clean, controlled exits that would minimize exposure and preserve her public image. And then she thought about Graham standing at that altar right now, confident, perfectly dressed, absolutely certain that she would come through those doors and hand him exactly what he came for. And something in her went rigid. She was not going to disappear. She was not going to give him the additional satisfaction of a story about the woman who fell apart and couldn't show her face. She would walk into that church. She would face every single one of those 300 people. And she would leave on her own terms. She wheeled herself out of the preparation room and into the side corridor that led to the main entrance of the nave. That was when she heard the soft metallic grinding from the left rear wheel of her chair. It had been making that sound intermittently for 2 days, and she had meant to have it checked. Now in the corridor, it locked slightly, just enough resistance to throw off her momentum. She reached down to adjust the wheel casing by hand, but the angle was wrong, and she couldn't get sufficient grip. A man crouched beside her without a word. He was in a gray uniform church maintenance staff from the look of it. He had a utility cloth in one hand, and he examined the wheel mechanism with the quiet efficiency of someone who fixed things as a matter of routine rather than heroism. He pressed 2 fingers into the casing joint, applied pressure at a specific angle, and the resistance released. He stood back up and didn't say anything. He didn't smile at her in that particular way. People smiled at her when they'd done her a small favor, the smile that contained underneath it some measure of relief at their own generosity. He simply stepped back and moved to return to whatever he had been doing before. "Wait," Evelyn said. Nathan Cole turned around. He was in his early 40s, with the kind of face that didn't ask to be noticed. Not rough, not soft, just steady. His expression held no anticipation, no particular curiosity. He was simply present and willing to listen. Evelyn's mind was moving fast. She could hear the organ clearly now. She could hear the low murmur of the crowd beginning to settle. In 60 seconds, someone would open the doors at the end of this corridor, and every pair of eyes in that church would turn toward the entrance, and she would either be facing them alone or not. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to hear the whole question before you answer it." Nathan waited. She told him concisely what she knew. Not everything. Not the video. Not the details of Graham's betrayal. Just the fact that the man she was supposed to marry had made certain things clear to her in the last few minutes, that she was not going to go through with the ceremony, and that she needed to walk into that church and walk back out without looking like a woman who had been destroyed by what just happened. She told him that she needed someone beside her when she did it. Not a bodyguard, not her assistant, someone who would simply stand next to her and make it possible for her to leave with her head up. She told him she understood it was an unreasonable thing to ask a stranger. She told him she wouldn't ask if she had another option. Nathan looked at the double doors at the end of the corridor. Through them, faintly came the sound of the organ and the shuffling quiet of 300 people waiting. He had been working at St. Peter's for 8 months. Part-time hours, straightforward work. He was not a man who involved himself in situations that didn't belong to him, and he was not a man who made large decisions quickly. The instinct to decline was immediate and uncomplicated. This was not his problem. This was not his world, and nothing about his life had prepared him for whatever was on the other side of those doors. But he had crouched next to her wheelchair 2 minutes ago without thinking about it, and she had not thanked him the way people thank someone they consider to be performing a service. She had looked at him the way people look at each other when they're just 2 people in a hallway, and something about that had been disarming in a way he hadn't fully registered until right now. "What exactly do you need me to do?" he said. "Stand next to me," Evelyn said. "Walk with me in, walk with me out. That's all. And after that, nothing. You go back to your day." He looked at her for a moment, not weighing her, not calculating, just deciding whether he believed her. Then he set his utility cloth down on the window ledge beside him and said, "All right." The doors at the end of the corridor opened. An usher appeared ready to cue the entrance. He saw Evelyn in her gown, saw Nathan standing beside her in a gray maintenance uniform, and his expression moved through confusion before professional training reasserted itself. Evelyn did not look at the usher. She looked straight ahead at the long white aisle, and the rows of faces already beginning to turn toward her. She could see Graham at the altar, relaxed hands clasped lightly in front of him, the picture of a man who had no reason to be concerned. The photographer raised his camera. The organ swelled. She moved forward. Nathan walked beside her, not in front and not behind. He didn't reach for her chair. He didn't hover. He simply moved at the same pace she set, with the same level of attention a person gives to any room they've decided to walk through. He didn't look at the guests. He looked ahead the same direction she was looking, as though the two of them were heading toward the same destination and had simply agreed to get there together. The murmur started at the back of the room and traveled forward. Evelyn watched Graham's expression shift, the smile holding for 1 second, too long, before it broke into something uncertain. She wheeled herself to the center of the aisle, close enough that he could see her face, clearly close enough that the whole church could see what she was about to do. She turned her chair to face the room. "I'm not getting married today," she said. Her voice was even and carried without effort through the silence. "I apologize for your time." Then she turned back around and moved toward the exit, and Nathan walked beside her, and the 300 guests of the wedding of the decade sat in their silk and tailored wool and said absolutely nothing. The photographs were everywhere before they even reached the street. Someone in the back row had a phone raised when Evelyn turned her chair away from the altar, and by the time she and Nathan pushed through the side exit onto the avenue, the image had already been shared several hundred times. By evening, it would be several 100,000. The framing was almost cinematic. The bride in white, the man in the gray uniform beside her, the blur of 300 stunned faces behind them. The caption that took hold across every platform was some variation of the same 7 words: "Millionaire leaves, groom for church janitor." Evelyn's head of communications called within 4 minutes of their exit. Evelyn declined the call. Her assistant called next. She declined that one too. Nathan stood on the sidewalk beside her, while her driver pulled the car around, watching the avenue with the expression of a man observing weather he didn't predict and can't change. "You should probably know," he said, "that someone just took our picture." "I know," Evelyn said. "More than one someone." "I know that too." The car arrived. Her driver loaded the wheelchair into the trunk with practiced efficiency and said nothing about the man in the maintenance uniform who folded himself into the back seat beside his employer. They drove uptown in silence, while Evelyn's phone continued to register calls she didn't answer, and Nathan watched the city move past the window as though he were simply taking a different route home. She had her driver drop him at the corner nearest to St. Peter's. Before he got out, she handed him a business card, plain just her name and a direct number, and said that, if there were any consequences for him from what had happened today, she wanted to know about it. Nathan looked at the card, put it in his shirt pocket, and said he appreciated it. Then he got out, and she watched him walk back in the direction of the church, and she sat in the back of her car on 5th Avenue with the wreckage of her wedding day settling around her like dust after a building comes down. The consequences she had anticipated began arriving the following morning. Her brother called first. Robert Hayes was 7 years older than Evelyn and had spent most of his adult life orbiting the family company without ever running it, which had left him with a talent for expressing grievance and very little else. His position was that she had humiliated the family publicly, that she had behaved erratically, and that associating herself even briefly, even in the photographs with a maintenance worker, had made her look unstable in a way that would damage investor confidence. He did not ask her what had happened. He did not ask her whether she was all right. He asked her what she intended to do about the coverage, and when she told him she intended to do nothing, he told her she was making a serious mistake. She thanked him for calling and ended the conversation. The board was quieter about it, but more precise. Her general counsel forwarded a message from 3 senior directors expressing concern about the optics of the situation and asking whether a statement might be appropriate. She forwarded the message to communications and told them to draft something bland and non-committal which was what the board actually wanted. It wasn't about the truth, it was about the appearance of control, which was something Evelyn understood better than any of them. What she had not anticipated was what was happening to Nathan. She found out through a second-hand source, a contact at one of the tabloids, who owed her a favor and occasionally traded information. The coverage of Nathan had moved quickly from curiosity to something more pointed. A narrative was forming fed by anonymous quotes that were not anonymous to anyone paying attention, presenting Nathan as an opportunist who had positioned himself deliberately near a vulnerable woman on the worst day of her life. The word exploitation appeared in 2 separate articles by the second day. One outlet ran a piece under the headline, "Who is Nathan Cole, and what does he want?" from Evelyn Hayes. She called the number on the card she had given him. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Have you seen what they're writing?" she said. "Some of it," Nathan said. "Are you still at the church?" There was a brief gap before he answered. "They let me go this morning," said the situation had created complications for the parish. Evelyn set down the coffee she'd been holding. The view from her penthouse on the 43rd floor showed Manhattan in flat gray November, light the kind of morning that made the city look like a photograph of itself, rather than the real thing. She had been sitting at her desk since 6, working through the week's operational reports, as though none of the last 48 hours had occurred. It was what she always did. Work was the one environment she could fully control, and control was the only thing that had ever made her feel safe. "Come to the office," she said. "That's not necessary," Nathan said. "You lost your job because of something I asked you to do. That makes it necessary." He came. Not to the office. In the end, she reconsidered and had him brought to the penthouse instead, where there would be no staff watching, no assistants reading the situation and drawing conclusions that would circulate through the building by afternoon. He arrived at noon in the same gray jacket he'd worn at the church, which he had apparently not replaced, and he sat in the chair across from her desk, with the same quality of stillness he'd had in the church corridor, the stillness of someone who didn't need to fill a room in order to feel entitled to be in it. She explained the situation clearly. She was responsible for his job loss. She wanted to offer him a position with Hayes Group in facilities management. The salary was fair, and the offer had no other conditions attached to it. She slid a single sheet across the desk, with the terms written out. Nathan read it. He set it back on the desk without picking up the pen she'd placed beside it. "I don't want a job as an apology," he said. "It's not an apology," Evelyn said. "It's a correction. Those are different things." "In your world, maybe," Nathan said. "Where I come from, someone handing you a piece of paper you didn't ask for and expecting you to sign it is still just someone handing you a piece of paper." Evelyn looked at him. In 20 years of negotiation across boardrooms full of men who had tried every available approach to make her feel that her position was temporary or provisional, she had developed a reliable sense for the difference between resistance that was performative and resistance that was structural. Nathan's was structural. He was not bargaining. He was not waiting for a better offer. He genuinely did not want what she was offering, which meant the offering itself had been the wrong move. She pulled the paper back. "Then what do you want?" she said. "I don't want anything from you," Nathan said without hostility. "I helped because it seemed like the right thing to do. That's where it ends for me." It should have been a clean conclusion. It wasn't. The power went out 3 weeks later during a November storm that knocked out a transformer serving the Upper East Side. It was 11 in the evening, and Evelyn was in the penthouse alone, which was her ordinary condition, and one she had long since stopped noticing. The backup generator handled the building's essential systems, but not the apartment's main lighting, and she sat in the near dark for a few minutes, doing nothing which was not her ordinary condition, and one she noticed immediately. She called Nathan because his number was still in her phone from the conversation about the job. She told herself it was because she needed someone to check the building's secondary electrical panel, which was a reason that made a specific kind of sense. He arrived within 40 minutes, examined the panel, confirmed there was nothing to be done until the transformer was restored, and sat down in the chair he had occupied 3 weeks earlier because she did not ask him to leave, and he did not offer to go. They talked in the half-dark for 3 hours, not about the scandal or the board or Graham, about things that were harder to organize into a controlled presentation about what it felt like to build something so large that the thing itself became the identity until the person doing the building was no longer clear on whether she was running the company or the company was running her. About what it felt like to have an accident redefine the way every person in every room looked at you, and to spend 4 years performing a version of yourself that proved the redefinition wrong until the performance was so complete you had forgotten what it was performing over. Nathan listened the way people listen when they are not waiting for their turn to speak. When he talked, he was spare about it, not guarded, just economical. He had been in New York for 6 years. Before that, somewhere quieter. He had lost his wife to an illness that moved faster than any of the doctors had predicted, and after that, he had spent a long time simply continuing working, existing, being present in each day without any particular story about where the days were leading. "Doesn't that bother you?" Evelyn said. "Not having a direction." "I have a direction," Nathan said. "I just don't need it to be impressive." She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the storm was still moving through the city rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows, making the lights of the buildings below look like they were underwater. "Nobody talks to me like that," she said. "Like what? Like the answer is obvious, and I've just been asking the wrong question." Nathan looked at the window. "I'm not trying to give you answers," he said. "I don't know your life well enough for that." "You know it better than most people," Evelyn said. "Most people know the version I show them." The lights came back on at 2 in the morning, too bright after the hours of quiet. They both sat back slightly against the sudden change. The room looked different in full light, the desk with its ranked files, the walls that held no personal photographs, the space that was organized around function and efficiency and gave nothing away about the person who lived in it. Evelyn noticed it the way you notice your own house, after being away all at once from the outside. Nathan left shortly after. He said goodnight the same way he said everything without decoration. Evelyn sat at her desk after the elevator closed and did not open her laptop or pick up her phone or do any of the things she would normally do with late-night hours. She just sat aware that something had shifted and uncertain about what to do with the awareness. She did not have long to consider it. Graham's response came in the form of a story placed in 3 financial news outlets simultaneously, which indicated coordination and planning rather than spontaneous media engagement. The story's thesis was precise and damaging, that Nathan Cole had deliberately inserted himself into a crisis moment with the calculated intent of gaining access to Evelyn Hayes, and through her, to her company's assets. It cited unnamed sources close to Evelyn's personal circle. It used language like manipulative pattern and predatory positioning. It was not the scattershot work of someone angry. It was the structured work of someone with legal training who understood exactly how much could be implied without being stated. 2 days after the story ran, Evelyn's board requested an emergency meeting. The room held 9 people, not counting Evelyn, and the temperature was the particular temperature of a group of people who have already made a decision and are presenting it as a conversation. The lead director, a man named Douglas Whitfield, who had been on the board for 11 years and had opposed her at every significant juncture before eventually being brought around by results, told her that the ongoing media situation was creating uncertainty among institutional investors. He told her the association with Nathan Cole, whatever its nature, needed to be formally concluded publicly before the company's annual investor presentation in 7 weeks. "And if I don't," Evelyn said. Whitfield's expression was measured. "Then the board would need to consider whether current leadership is positioned to manage the current environment." She understood the sentence completely. It was not a threat. It was a schedule. She said she would consider the board's concerns and give them her answer before the end of the week. Then she went back to her office and sat behind her desk and looked at the Manhattan skyline through the window and felt for the first time in a very long time that the walls of the room she'd built around herself were actually closing in. Nathan called that evening. He had seen the financial press coverage. He was not panicked about it. He didn't have enough investment in the outcome to panic, but he was direct. "This is going to keep coming," he said, "as long as I'm in the picture in any way." "You're not in the picture," Evelyn said. "We've had 2 conversations and 1 phone call. That's not how it reads from outside." "I don't run my life based on how things read from outside." "You run a company," Nathan said. "That's different." She didn't answer that because he was right, and they both knew it. Nathan said goodnight. She told him she'd be in touch. She sat in the penthouse for another hour after the call ended, aware of a specific kind of silence that had nothing to do with the absence of sound. The silence of a room after someone has just been in it and left. She didn't hear from him the following day, or the day after that. On the 3rd day, she called. The number rang through to voicemail. She called again in the evening and got the same result. She had her assistant make a discreet inquiry through the building management office at St. Peter's, which confirmed that Nathan Cole had not been seen at the church and had not left a forwarding contact. She understood in the abstract what he had done and why he had done it. He had made the same calculation she had made 100 times in her professional life, assessed the cost his presence was creating for someone else, decided the cost was too high, and removed himself cleanly. It was a rational decision. It was, by most measures, a kind one. She stood at the window of the penthouse 43 floors above the city, in the apartment she had spent 4 years making airtight against anyone who might get close enough to leave when they decided to go. And she thought he still left. The call came through her general counsel's office 2 days later. A representative of Graham Sullivan's legal team had reached out, requesting a meeting regarding a private matter. Her counsel forwarded the specifics. The private matter, as it turned out, was Nathan Cole. Graham's people had located him. They had, according to the account that reached Evelyn through sources she moved quickly to activate, made their position clear in terms that were not purely verbal. They had offered him a settlement, a sum of money, in exchange for a signed agreement that he would make no further public statements about Evelyn Hayes, have no further contact with her, and leave New York within 30 days. The agreement, her source said, had been presented in a parking structure in Queens, and the conversation had not begun with the paperwork. Evelyn sat with this information for the length of time it took her to understand it completely. What it meant about Graham, what it meant about her own silence over the past 3 days, while Nathan had been unreachable, and what it meant about the story she had been telling herself for 4 years, about how protection was the same thing as control. She had believed after the accident that the only way to keep from being damaged again was to keep everything at a distance that she managed. The company, the board, the public image, the people who came close enough to matter. She had called it discipline. She had called it strategy. It had taken Nathan Cole disappearing into a parking structure in Queens for her to understand what it actually was. It was fear, dressed in very expensive clothing. She picked up the phone and called her general counsel. She told him to find Nathan. She told him to find him tonight. And then she told him what she was going to say at the investor presentation in 6 weeks, and the line was quiet for long enough that she asked if he was still there. He said he was. He said he would advise against it. She said she understood, and he should find Nathan, and they would talk about the rest in the morning. They found Nathan in a motel in Woodside, Queens, the kind of place that charged by the week and asked nothing about your situation. He had a bruised jaw and 2 cracked ribs, according to the brief medical report Evelyn's counsel obtained after arranging for a doctor to see him that night. He had not filed a police report. He had not called anyone. He had simply checked in, drawn the curtains, and been unreachable, which was, as Evelyn was beginning to understand, what Nathan Cole did when the damage was bad enough. He went somewhere quiet and absorbed it alone, without asking anyone to witness it. She went to Woodside herself the following morning. Her driver pulled up outside the motel at 8, and she transferred to her wheelchair on the sidewalk, while a few early commuters walked past without looking twice. The motel's entrance had one step up from street level, and no ramp, which meant Nathan had to come down to the doorway to meet her, which he did in a gray undershirt, and the same jacket from before, the bruising along the left side of his jaw, visible in the flat morning light. He looked at her in the doorway with the wariness of someone who was not expecting to be found, and had not yet decided how to feel about it. "You didn't have to come here," he said. "I know," Evelyn said. "I came anyway." She told him what she knew about Graham's people and the parking structure. She told him she had spoken to her legal team the previous night, and that a formal complaint was being filed that morning, regardless of whether Nathan chose to participate in it. He listened with his arms folded and said nothing until she finished. "You don't need to do that for me," he said. "I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do," Evelyn said, "which is apparently the only reason you do anything, so you should understand it." Nathan looked at her for a moment, and then quietly he laughed. It was brief and slightly pained, given the condition of his ribs, but it was real, and she had not seen it before, and it changed the shape of his face in a way that made him look like someone who had once laughed easily and had just now remembered it. "The investor presentation is in 6 weeks, she said when the moment settled. "The board wants me to come in and manage the narrative, make everything neat again." She looked at the sidewalk, then back up at him. "I'm not going to do that." Nathan's expression was careful. "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done at the beginning," she said. "I'm going to tell the truth." She expected him to argue with her, to say it wasn't worth it, that the cost to the company was too high, that she should protect what she had built. Instead, he simply looked at her with the same steadiness he'd had in the church corridor 4 weeks ago, the look of someone who already knew what she was going to decide and had been waiting for her to catch up to it. "All right," he said. "You want me there?" "I want you there if you want to be there," Evelyn said. "Not because I need you as evidence, because I'd like you to be in the room." He said he would think about it. She had her driver bring him to a proper medical facility that afternoon to have his ribs assessed, which he accepted with minimal argument, less than she'd expected, which told her the pain was worse than he was showing. She went back to the penthouse and spent the evening reviewing the presentation materials her communications team had prepared, careful language strategic concessions, a narrative that preserved the board's confidence by sacrificing any version of the truth that might make them uncomfortable. It was well constructed. It was exactly the kind of thing she would have approved without hesitation a year ago. She deleted it and started from nothing. The investor presentation was held in Hayes Group's main conference facility on the 28th floor, a room designed to communicate permanence and solidity with dark wood paneling and a long table that seated 30. The full board was present. So were representatives from the company's 4 largest institutional investors, 2 senior partners from the company's legal firm, and because word had moved through certain channels in advance that something significant might occur, 3 financial journalists who had been granted press access and were seated along the wall with recorders already running. Robert Hayes had also been given a seat at his own insistence. Near the far end of the table, the position of a man who wanted to be in the room without being responsible for what happened in it. Douglas Whitfield opened the session with a brief statement about the quarter's performance, which was strong because Evelyn had made sure of that. Whatever happened in this room today, she was not walking in with weak numbers. She sat at the head of the table and let him finish, and then took the floor without preamble. She did not use the presentation deck her team had prepared. She did not use any deck. She spoke directly without notes, in the same voice she used in every room she had ever needed to control. She told them about the video. She had brought a copy. She played it from a tablet connected to the room's display screen, and the sound of Graham Sullivan's voice filled the conference room, the bar noise in the background, the laughter, The words he had used about her disability, the words he had used about the company's shares. She let it run to the end. Then she closed the file and set the tablet face down on the table. Nobody spoke. I received that footage 20 minutes before my wedding ceremony, she said. I made the decision in that corridor that I wasn't going to be managed out of the room, that I was going to walk in and walk out on my own terms. And the person who made it possible for me to do that was a man named Nathan Cole, who had nothing to gain from helping me, and has since lost a job, been defamed in the financial press, and been physically threatened by parties acting on behalf of Graham Sullivan. She looked around the table, holding each face briefly. I want to be clear about what this board has been asked to protect over the past 7 weeks. It was not investor confidence. It was not the company. It was the version of events that was most convenient for the person who orchestrated the betrayal. Whitfield's expression had not changed significantly since the video ended. He had the face of a man who was recalculating in real time. "Evelyn," he said, "if this footage is authentic, it's authentic," she said. "My legal team has verified it. It has also been submitted this morning to the district attorney's office in connection with the incident in Queens." She let that settle. "I'm not here to ask for your approval of my personal choices. I'm here because this company is mine. I built it, and I have run it honestly for 16 years. What I will not do is stand in front of this room and pretend that the last 7 weeks didn't happen in order to make a group of people who never once asked if I was all right feel comfortable about their portfolio." At the far end of the table, Robert said nothing. He looked at the surface in front of him with the particular stillness of someone who has just understood that the argument he came prepared to make is no longer relevant. The room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet, when the temperature of a situation shifts beyond what the usual procedures cover. The door at the back of the conference room opened. Nathan came in. He had found a dark suit somewhere in the weeks since the church. Not new, the fabric carrying the particular softness of something worn a few times over many years, brought out for occasions that didn't come often. The bruising on his jaw had faded from deep purple to a faint greenish yellow. He had clearly considered whether to try to conceal what remained of it, and decided against the effort. He walked to the empty chair along the wall, not at the table, not at the front of the room, and sat down with his hands resting in his lap. He looked at Evelyn without performance, without agenda, his attention on her the way it had been in every room they had shared, steady, complete, requiring nothing back. She had not been certain he would come. She had not asked him a second time. The fact of his presence moved through her in a way that she kept off her face, because some things were worth protecting, not because they needed to be hidden, but because they were real, and the room was full of people who had earned very little access to the real things. She turned back to the board. "I want to talk about the next quarter," she said. Graham Sullivan's legal exposure became public within 2 weeks of the presentation. The footage once formally submitted to the district attorney's office was no longer a private matter, and the story it told, about a calculated marriage strategy, about the coordinated pressure campaign against Nathan, about the events in the parking structure in Queens, moved through the press with the speed of something that had been building pressure for months and finally found an opening. Graham's firm placed him on indefinite leave before the end of the first week. 2 of the institutional investors Evelyn had faced in that conference room sent formal communications to her office expressing their continued confidence in Hayes Group's leadership. Whitfield called her directly and said in the particular tone of a man who has been wrong and knows it, that the board's position had been reconsidered. She thanked him. She meant it partially. The rest she filed away as information. Robert called 2 days after the presentation. He did not apologize directly. That was not a thing he had practiced doing, but he asked whether there was anything he could do to help with the fund she'd mentioned in the press release that followed the presentation. She told him she'd let him know. It was the most honest conversation they'd had in years, which was not saying a great deal, but it was something. Nathan had gone back to his apartment in Jackson Heights after the presentation. He was not employed by Hayes Group and had not agreed to be. The distance between them was the same distance it had always been, except that now there was something on both sides of it that neither of them had named, but both of them could feel. She called him 2 weeks after the presentation and asked if he would be willing to meet. He said yes. She took a car to Jackson Heights, not her usual car, just a car, and they walked for an hour along a route that accommodated her wheelchair without requiring any particular adjustment on his part, because he had paid attention to the neighborhood's geometry in a way she hadn't expected and simply moved in a direction that worked. She didn't remark on it. It was the kind of thing that didn't need to be remarked on. She told him about the fund. She had been thinking about it since before the presentation, in the hours she'd spent at her desk, deleting the prepared speech and rebuilding from nothing. The company had a corporate social responsibility arm that had mostly functioned as a reputational vehicle grants to institutions that made the annual report look good, partnerships with charities that never required actual operational involvement. She wanted to take a portion of that funding and redirect it toward something functional, a program that helped people with physical disabilities navigate re-entry into the workforce. Not inspirational content, not awareness campaigns, but actual practical assistance. Legal support for workplace accommodation claims. Connections to employers who had committed to real hiring, not quota performance. Job training programs that assumed competence rather than starting from a deficit. She told him she wanted him to run the operational side of it. Nathan listened. He did not look for the catch. After everything that had passed between them, he understood that her offers didn't usually have catches. They had conditions that were clearly stated, which was a different thing entirely. "Why me?" he said. "Because you know what the work is actually like," Evelyn said. "Not the theory of it, the actual texture of it, and because you don't need it to be impressive." He said he would think about it. He thought about it for 3 days, and then called her, and said yes. The fund launched quietly the following spring. No press event, no ceremony. Evelyn had seen enough ceremonies to last several lifetimes. The announcement went out through a single press release and a page on the Hayes Group website, and the response was larger and faster than either of them had anticipated, which meant the first months were mostly spent building infrastructure where none had existed, and learning in real time the difference between funding something and actually running it. Nathan was good at it in the way Evelyn had predicted, not because he had training in nonprofit administration or workforce development, but because he treated every person who came through the intake process as a person rather than a case. He was unhurried in the way people are unhurried when they're not performing patients. He hired 2 staff members in the first quarter, both of them former clients of similar programs who understood the terrain from the inside. He built a reporting structure that was simple and actually told you what was happening, rather than what looked good in a summary. Evelyn remained CEO of Hayes Group and ran the fund as a subsidiary. The overlap between the 2 roles meant her days were longer, her schedule more complex, and her tolerance for the kind of meeting that produced nothing of substance had contracted to approximately 0, which her board had adjusted to with the efficiency of people who had learned to adjust. She was no less exacting than she had ever been. She was less interested in managing appearances for their own sake, which was a different thing, and one that, over time, made the work cleaner. She and Nathan worked alongside each other with the particular ease of people who have skipped several of the social stages that normally precede ease, because the circumstances under which they'd met had burned off the preliminary distance all at once. They disagreed regularly about pace and priorities and the question of when to escalate versus absorb. He thought she moved too fast. She thought he was occasionally too willing to accept a limitation that could be pushed through. Both of them were sometimes right. One evening in early fall, they were the last 2 people in the fund's small office on Lexington Avenue, a rented space that was functional and unglamorous, nothing like the Hayes Group floors uptown. Nathan was finishing a report at the desk near the window. Evelyn was reviewing intake files on the other side of the room. The light outside had shifted to the particular amber of late afternoon in September, and the city outside was in its end-of-day density of traffic and movement, and the office held the quiet of a space where actual work gets done. Evelyn set down the file she'd been reading. She looked at Nathan across the room, at the familiar steadiness of him, the quality of presence that had been identical in a church corridor in November to what it was here in this ordinary office on an ordinary evening. "Nathan," she said. He looked up. "I want to say something, and I don't want you to answer it right away," she said. "I just want to say it." He set down his pen. "You didn't save me from the scandal," she said. "I could have handled the scandal. I've handled worse professionally." She kept her voice level and direct the way she'd kept it in every room that mattered. "You saved me from finishing the process of becoming someone I couldn't stand. Someone who'd decided that being untouchable was the same as being safe." She looked at the amber light on the window. "I don't know what that's worth to you, but I wanted to say it out loud, at least once." To someone who was actually in the room. The office was quiet. Nathan looked at her with the expression she had come to understand was his most honest one, not warm in any performed sense, just present completely and without reservation. "I know," he said. "I've been waiting for you to get around to it." She almost laughed. "That's all you have to say?" "I said I'd wait before answering," Nathan said. "You didn't say I had to make it long." Outside, the city moved through its evening patterns, indifferent and continuous, the way New York always does, as though whatever is happening in any given room is no more or less significant than everything else happening simultaneously in every other room across the 5 boroughs. Inside the small office on Lexington Avenue, Evelyn Hayes turned back to her intake files, and Nathan Cole turned back to his report. And the amber light held for another few minutes before the sun dropped below the buildings, and the room shifted into the comfortable gray of early evening. Neither of them moved to turn on the overhead light. There are things money can protect you from, and the list is long and real, and Evelyn had never had any illusions about that. It can protect you from certain kinds of precarity, from certain kinds of powerlessness, from needing to ask for help in ways that leave you exposed. But it cannot protect you from a video played on a phone in a dressing room 20 minutes before the ceremony that tells you the person you chose you for the wrong reason. It cannot protect you from a room full of 300 people watching you understand, in real time, that the life you had arranged around yourself was arranged around a lie. And it cannot protect you from the specific loneliness of having built something so large and so well defended that there is no longer any gap in the walls through which anything real can enter. What moved Nathan Cole to crouch beside a woman's wheelchair in a church corridor and fix the mechanism without being asked, without waiting to see who she was? First, that was not something you could build toward, or purchase, or arrange. It was just what he did, because it was what the moment required. That was the whole of it. And somehow, out of that plain and unremarkable act, the rest had followed, not cleanly or easily or without cost, but in the way that real things follow from real moments, not because someone planned it that way, but because neither of them looked away when it mattered. The city went on outside the window, enormous and loud and entirely unaware. In the small office on Lexington Avenue, the two of them remained at their desks until the work was finished, and then they turned off the lights and left together.